At some point, without noticing, I stopped leading my own life. It didn't happen during a fight. It didn't happen after a betrayal. It happened quietly in moments that looked like love. Small adjustments, small permissions, small silences. Until one morning, I found myself asking for approval to do things I used to decide without hesitation. Here's the uncomfortable truth most men never hear. The faster you try to become a better partner, the faster attraction begins to die. Not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped standing. What feels like consideration slowly becomes submission. What feels like compromise turns into self-erasure. And what you call love starts to feel like management. This isn't a story about bad women or weak men. It's about a psychological trap built into modern relationships. A trap that rewards emotional overinvestment and punishes authenticity. A trap that convinces men to give up leadership in exchange for peace and leaves both people quietly dissatisfied. If this sounds familiar, stay with me. Before we go further, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you value calm, honest conversations about relationships and human behavior, consider subscribing to the channel. 2 years earlier, I was not this man. Back then, I didn't rehearse conversations in my head before speaking. I didn't calculate tone timing or emotional fallout. I made plans. I chose direction. If I wanted to play golf on the weekend, I checked my calendar and went. If I wanted to see friends, I did. If I had an idea, I voiced it without testing the emotional temperature of the room first. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't cruel. I was simply grounded in myself. Somewhere along the way, that center disappeared. The unsettling part is that I can't tell you when it happened. There was no argument that marked the shift. No dramatic moment where I surrendered control. No conscious decision to hand over leadership in my own relationship. If you had asked me at the time, I would have said everything was fine. Better than fine. Stable, mature, healthy. That's how this transformation hides. It starts with one small choice that feels reasonable. She had a dinner planned with her friends on the same night as my usual guys' night. I skipped mine. It didn't feel like a sacrifice. It felt supportive. Then another moment. I suggested a restaurant and she hesitated. I said, "You're better at picking places we'll both like." That sounded thoughtful, cooperative, adult. Later, when planning a weekend, I caught myself asking, "Is this okay with you?" instead of saying, "This is what I'm doing." That phrasing slipped out naturally. I didn't stop it. Each moment was defensible on its own. That's the danger. At no point did she demand control. At no point did she issue ultimatums. She didn't need to. I was doing the work myself. I was anticipating her preferences, preempting discomfort, adjusting my behavior to keep things smooth. What I didn't realize was that I had shifted from leading to managing. Not managing logistics, managing emotions. I began to time conversations carefully. Certain topics were safer in the morning, others were better postponed. Some ideas weren't worth bringing up at all. Not because they were wrong, but because they might cause tension. I told myself this was emotional intelligence, consideration, growth. In reality, it was fear dressed as maturity. I noticed the change in small, embarrassing ways. Standing in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, preparing her elaborate coffee exactly the way she liked it. Oat milk. 3 different sugar substitutes. Not because she demanded it, because I didn't want to disappoint her, because starting the day right felt important. While doing it, I was mentally rehearsing how to ask if it would be okay for me to play golf that weekend. That was the moment something clicked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet recognition. I was asking permission for my own life. What disturbed me most wasn't that I had changed. People change in relationships. What disturbed me was how invisible the change had been while it was happening. I didn't wake up one day feeling controlled. I woke up feeling cautious, and caution felt responsible. Looking back, I can see the pattern clearly. At the beginning of the relationship, I led naturally. I made plans. I decided where we went. I created experiences and invited her into them. She responded to that. She enjoyed it. There was ease, movement, direction. As time passed and emotional investment increased, my behavior shifted. I wanted the relationship to work. I wanted her to feel safe, heard, comfortable. So I softened edges. I deferred more. I adjusted faster. I told myself this was what commitment looked like. But commitment, when misunderstood, becomes self-abandonment. Without realizing it, I stopped being the driver of my own relationship and became a passenger. Not a resentful passenger, a polite one. The kind who watches the road, carefully offering suggestions only when asked, hoping not to upset the person behind the wheel. The irony is that I believed this would make me a better partner, more attractive, more secure. I believed that by prioritizing her comfort, I was strengthening the bond. Instead, I was slowly dissolving the very qualities that made the relationship feel alive in the first place. I wasn't being dishonest. I wasn't pretending to be someone else. I was worse than that. I was editing myself, filtering impulses, softening convictions, choosing peace over truth in moments where truth would have cost me nothing but discomfort. And the cost of doing that repeatedly was far greater than I understood. I could feel it internally before I could articulate it. A dull sense of displacement, like living in a house that had been rearranged while I was asleep. Everything was still there, but nothing was where I instinctively reached for it. My routines revolved around her schedule. My weekends adjusted around her social calendar. My preferences were negotiable. Hers were assumed. I told myself this was partnership. But partnership without polarity becomes administration. What's most unsettling is that she didn't seem happier either. On the surface, things looked fine. We didn't fight much. We communicated. We coordinated. From the outside, the relationship probably looked stable, even ideal. Inside, something was missing. A tension that had once existed not as conflict, but as energy. I could sense her frustration in subtle ways. Not anger, disappointment. A kind of quiet dissatisfaction that had no obvious cause. She carried more responsibility than she wanted, made more decisions than she enjoyed, managed details she never asked to manage. And somehow, neither of us could name the problem. That's when it becomes dangerous. Because when a relationship looks good but feels hollow, people start blaming the wrong things. They look for novelty, for excitement, for explanations outside themselves. Rarely do they consider that the structure itself has inverted. I had slowly transferred authority I didn't need to give away to someone who didn't truly want it. And in doing so, I placed us both in roles that felt unnatural. I didn't lose leadership because she took it from me. I lost it because I offered it piece by piece under the illusion that love required it. And once leadership is gone, it doesn't announce its absence. It just leaves behind confusion, resentment, a sense that something essential has slipped away, even though nothing dramatic has happened. That's the quiet beginning of the real crisis. For a long time, I told myself I was doing the right thing. I wasn't absent. I wasn't careless. I wasn't selfish. I listened. I adjusted. I paid attention. I tried to be considerate in every decision that affected both of us. If there was tension, I smoothed it out. If there was uncertainty, I deferred. If there was discomfort, I absorbed it. I believed this was what being a good partner meant. That belief was the trap. What no one explains to men is that there is a critical difference between consideration and self-subordination. One strengthens relationships. The other quietly destroys them. The problem is that from the inside, they feel almost identical. Both involve compromise. Both involve empathy. Both look mature on the surface. But the outcomes could not be more different. At some point, I realized my role in the relationship had changed. I was no longer sharing a life I was actively creating. I was maintaining a system, coordinating schedules, managing moods, preventing friction. Love had turned procedural, less about desire, more about regulation. I wasn't leading anymore. I was administering. The shift didn't make me feel noble. It made me feel tense, alert, like I was always slightly off balance, scanning for signals. Was this a good time to bring something up? Would this comment land wrong? Was this preference worth the emotional cost? Every interaction came with an internal calculation. That constant calculation is not intimacy, it's anxiety. What made it worse was the guilt. I couldn't justify my frustration because objectively, nothing was wrong. She wasn't abusive. She wasn't controlling in obvious ways. She didn't forbid anything outright. If anything, she would have said she just wanted a partner who was thoughtful and communicative. And I was doing exactly that. So why did it feel like I was shrinking? The answer became clear only after I stopped focusing on intentions and started observing structure. Relationships are not sustained by goodwill alone. They are sustained by roles, responsibilities, and direction. Someone has to lead. Someone has to decide. Someone has to hold the frame of the relationship when emotions fluctuate. Without that, everything becomes reactive. I had confused being a good partner with eliminating friction. I thought harmony was the goal. But harmony achieved by self-erasure is unstable. It requires constant effort and produces quiet resentment, not explosive resentment, the slow kind, the kind that dulls attraction and corrodes respect. I began to notice how often I framed my choices around her happiness instead of my own values, not shared values, her emotional comfort. That distinction matters. When your decisions are driven by fear of disappointing someone, you are no longer choosing. You are complying, and compliance is not attractive. There's a painful irony here. I was trying to preserve the relationship by giving more flexibility, more understanding, more emotional labor. But the more I gave in that way, the less solid I felt as a man. And the less solid I felt, the less secure the relationship became. Security does not come from constant accommodation. It comes from predictability of character, from knowing who someone is, where they stand, and what they will do when faced with pressure. I had made myself unpredictable by becoming too adaptable. Over time, I stopped expressing preferences unless asked. Not because I didn't have them, but because it was easier not to surface them. Expressing them might lead to a discussion, a negotiation, a subtle disappointment. Silence felt safer. Silence is not peace, it's withdrawal. I could feel myself becoming less grounded, less decisive, less sure. And with that came a subtle shift in how she responded to me. Not openly, not dramatically. Just a slight loss of spark, a faint impatience. A sense that something was missing, even if she couldn't articulate what. That's when I understood something most men learn too late. Attraction is not built on how well you manage someone else's emotions. It's built on how firmly you inhabit your own life. When a man gives up his center in an attempt to be accommodating, he doesn't become more desirable. He becomes less distinct. Distinctness is essential. Without it, relationships lose polarity. They become flat, functional, efficient, and quietly dead. I had turned myself into a manager instead of a man she could follow. Not because she demanded it, but because I believed that leadership was somehow selfish, that making unilateral decisions was inconsiderate, that asserting direction meant ignoring her needs. That belief is wrong. Leadership is not domination. It is responsibility. It is the willingness to choose a direction and accept the consequences. It is the courage to say, "This is what I'm doing," while remaining open to feedback, not dependent on approval. By abandoning that role, I didn't create equality. I created inversion. She ended up with more control than she wanted. I ended up with less authority than I needed. She felt burdened by having to manage decisions she didn't ask to manage. I felt diminished by having to ask permission for choices that should have been mine. Neither of us was satisfied. From the outside, the relationship still functioned. From the inside, it felt like we were both playing roles that didn't fit. She carried power without desire. I carried compliance without peace. This is what makes the trap so destructive. It doesn't look like dysfunction. It looks like maturity. It looks like compromise. It looks like modern partnership done right. Until it doesn't work anymore. I wasn't losing the relationship because I cared too little. I was losing it because I cared in the wrong way. I had replaced direction with deference, integrity with accommodation, presence with management. And once you cross that line, every attempt to fix the relationship using the same logic only makes things worse. More talking, more adjusting, more emotional labor. All of it reinforces the same imbalance. The truth is uncomfortable, but it's simple. A man who gives up leadership in his own life does not become easier to love. He becomes harder to respect. And without respect, attraction cannot survive. That realization marked the end of my confusion and the beginning of something more difficult but necessary. Once I stopped judging the situation emotionally and started examining it structurally, the pattern became impossible to ignore. What we were living inside was not a conflict of personalities. It was not poor communication. It was not a lack of love. It was an inverted power structure, one that quietly governs most modern relationships and slowly drains them of attraction, respect, and satisfaction. In our relationship, the person with less emotional investment held more control. And the person with more investment, me, adjusted himself accordingly. This inversion didn't come from malice. It came from misunderstanding how power actually functions in intimate relationships. Power in this context is not aggression. It's not authority enforced through fear. It's influence over outcomes, direction, the ability to decide what happens next without needing permission. In healthy dynamics, power is balanced through leadership and trust. In inverted dynamics, it's balanced through anxiety and appeasement. The person who cares less always has leverage. As my emotional investment increased, my willingness to tolerate discomfort decreased. I became more sensitive to her reactions, more alert to shifts in mood, more concerned with preserving stability. That concern translated into behavioral changes. I deferred more. I asked instead of stated. I waited instead of moved. Meanwhile, her investment did not increase in the same way. Not because she didn't care, but because she didn't need to. My accommodation reduced her need to invest further. The more I managed the relationship, the less she had to. This is where the inversion locks in. I had been taught that good relationships are democratic, that both people should have equal say in everything, equal responsibility for emotional climate, equal control over decisions. On paper, it sounds fair, progressive, respectful. Psychologically, it's a disaster. Attraction does not thrive in systems where responsibility is diffused. It thrives where direction is clear, where one person takes primary responsibility for movement, while the other chooses to engage with that movement. When no one leads, someone manages. And management is not attractive. I began to see how often I had transferred authority without realizing it. Not through arguments, but through avoidance. I didn't want to create tension, so I let her decide. I didn't want to disappoint, so I deferred. I didn't want to risk conflict, so I adjusted. Each decision made sense on its own. Together, they formed a system where I no longer trusted myself to act without approval. What made this particularly damaging was that she didn't actually want this power. She accepted it because it was offered, because refusing it would have required conflict, because someone had to decide and I had stepped back, so she decided. And the more she decided, the more I retreated. The more I retreated, the more responsibility fell on her. Until she felt burdened by leadership she never asked for, and I felt constrained by submission I could not sustain. This is the psychological dead zone where relationships slowly suffocate. She began to feel disappointed without knowing why. She had a partner who listened, accommodated, and cooperated, yet something essential was missing. I began to feel resentful without justification. I couldn't point to mistreatment. I couldn't name abuse. I just felt smaller. That combination is toxic. It produces a strange emotional climate where both people are dissatisfied but feel guilty for being so. She feels unfulfilled but blames herself. I feel constrained but blame my expectations. Neither of us questions the structure itself. This is why so many relationships that look perfect from the outside feel hollow on the inside. They have eliminated friction by eliminating polarity. They function smoothly, but feel lifeless. They operate like joint ventures instead of intimate partnerships. The inversion also distorts accountability. When leadership is unclear, blame floats. If something feels wrong, no one knows where to place responsibility. I blamed myself for not trying harder. She blamed the relationship for feeling stale. Neither of us addressed the real issue. Power inversion is subtle because it wears the mask of kindness. Every concession looks generous. Every deferral looks respectful. Every adjustment looks mature. Until the cumulative effect is a man who no longer inhabits his own life and a woman who no longer trusts his direction. I had mistaken equality of value for equality of role. They are not the same. Two people can be equal in worth while holding different responsibilities. Someone has to take the lead when decisions conflict. Someone has to create momentum. Someone has to hold the vision of where the relationship is going. When that role disappears, anxiety replaces leadership. I saw how often my decisions were driven not by conviction, but by anticipation. How will she react? Will this upset her? Is this worth the emotional cost? That internal dialogue became constant, exhausting, and entirely incompatible with attraction. Attraction requires certainty, not certainty about outcomes, but certainty about self. When a man is unsure of his right to choose, he radiates uncertainty. When he radiates uncertainty, he invites control, not because his partner is manipulative, but because the vacuum must be filled. Power never disappears. It only shifts. And once it shifts, reversing it becomes difficult. Not because she resists it consciously, but because the system has adapted. She has learned to decide. I have learned to comply. Both of us have been conditioned. This is why the problem feels unsolvable when approached emotionally. More communication doesn't help. More reassurance doesn't help. More accommodation accelerates the decline. The issue is not feelings, it's structure. I didn't need to express myself more. I needed to reclaim authorship of my life. I didn't need her permission to lead. I needed my own. Until that happened, no amount of love would fix what was broken. Because what was broken wasn't affection, it was direction. And without direction, relationships don't explode, they fade. What made the inversion so difficult to detect was how reasonable every step looked while it was happening. There was never a moment where I said, "I'm giving up my authority." There was never a conversation where she said, "I want to control everything." The reality was far more subtle. Authority didn't disappear. It leaked, slowly, through a series of decisions that each made sense in isolation. She suggested a restaurant because she had dietary restrictions. I agreed. That was practical. She coordinated social plans because she was better at keeping track of birthdays and events. I deferred. That was efficient. She cared more about how the apartment looked, so she made the household decisions. I stepped back. That was considerate. None of those choices felt like submission. They felt like teamwork. But teamwork without a clear leader doesn't create balance. It creates diffusion. And diffusion eventually turns into imbalance. Over time, I stopped initiating decisions in areas where I had once felt comfortable. Not because I didn't care, but because it felt easier to let her decide. Easier than discussing. Easier than negotiating. Easier than dealing with disappointment if my choice didn't align with hers. What I didn't understand was that every time I deferred, I was training both of us. I was teaching her that I didn't trust my own judgment enough to stand by it. And I was teaching myself that my preferences were secondary. This conditioning didn't happen overnight. It accumulated quietly. Eventually, I found myself seeking approval for decisions that had nothing to do with her. How I spent my free time, when I went to the gym, whether I could see my friends. Not because she demanded control, but because I had internalized the idea that autonomy required justification. That's when the emotional toll became impossible to ignore. I felt anxious without knowing why. Restless, but restrained. I couldn't explain the discomfort because nothing obvious was wrong. We weren't fighting, we weren't distant. We were functioning. And yet I felt like a supporting character in my own life. At the same time, she was carrying a weight she never asked for. She was managing decisions she didn't want to manage. Choosing direction she didn't want to choose. Holding responsibility she never requested. And instead of feeling empowered by that control, she felt burdened by it. This is the hidden cost of accommodation. It doesn't just diminish the man, it exhausts the woman. She wanted a partner who would take initiative, create momentum, and provide direction. What she got instead was someone constantly checking in, seeking validation, and outsourcing authority. That dynamic doesn't feel loving. It feels heavy. This is where what I call relationship anxiety disorder sets in. Both people feel dissatisfied, but neither can identify the source. She feels frustrated by his lack of leadership, but guilty for wanting more. He feels controlled and diminished, but ashamed for resenting someone who hasn't overtly wronged him. So nothing gets addressed. From the outside, the relationship looks stable. Internally, it's tense. Not loud tension, quiet tension. The kind that seeps into everyday interactions and drains energy over time. We had achieved equality by eliminating polarity. Without polarity, there is no spark, No contrast, no dynamic movement. Everything becomes flat, predictable, safe, and deeply unfulfilling. I began to notice how my presence had changed. I was less decisive in conversations, less assertive in plans, less grounded in my body. I spoke in questions instead of statements. I framed ideas as suggestions instead of intentions. And she noticed too, even if she couldn't articulate it. She became more critical, not aggressively, subtly, questioning my choices, rechecking decisions, taking over where I hesitated. Not because she wanted power, but because someone had to hold things together. This is how resentment forms on both sides. I resented feeling managed. She resented having to manage. Neither of us was wrong. We were just stuck inside a structure that rewarded the wrong behaviors and punished the right ones. The more I tried to be accommodating, the less respected I felt. The less respected I felt, the more disconnected I became. The more disconnected I became, the less present I was. And the less present I was, the more she felt alone in the relationship. It was a feedback loop that fed on good intentions. What made it particularly dangerous was how it reframed normal masculine independence as selfishness. Any attempt I made to assert preference felt like a violation of the unspoken agreement we had drifted into. A sudden shift from compliance to conviction created discomfort, so I avoided it. Avoidance became the default, and avoidance is the fastest way to lose yourself without noticing. I wasn't being oppressed. I was being erased by my own fear of friction. That's the truth most men don't want to face. The damage wasn't caused by her expectations. It was caused by my willingness to abandon myself to meet them. And once that pattern is established, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads, from small decisions to major ones, from logistics to identity, from habits to values. Eventually, you wake up in a life that technically works, but no longer feels like yours. That's not partnership. That's quiet surrender. Men lose leadership in relationships through two distinct paths. I've seen both. I've lived one. And once you understand them, you realize how inevitable the outcome is if nothing interrupts the process. The first path is immediate subordination. This happens when a man enters a relationship already convinced that he must compensate for some perceived deficiency. Maybe he believes she's out of his league. More attractive, more accomplished, more socially valued. Instead of showing up as himself, he shows up as a service provider. He leads with accommodation. He is flexible, always available, agreeable. He defers early and often. Not because he lacks opinions, but because he believes his best chance at keeping her interest is minimizing friction. He competes not on presence or direction, but on convenience. This strategy can work briefly. It creates access. It creates approval. It creates the appearance of harmony. But it establishes a dangerous foundation. His value becomes tied to how easy he is to deal with, not who he is. His role becomes conditional. As long as he continues to accommodate, the relationship continues. The moment he stops, tension appears. In this dynamic, leadership never exists. From the beginning, he positions himself as secondary. The relationship doesn't evolve into imbalance. It starts there, and once attraction fades, as it always does in systems built on compliance, he has nothing left to offer but more accommodation. That path is obvious when you know what to look for. The second path is far more common and far more deceptive. It's the path of gradual erosion. This is where a man enters the relationship with natural leadership. He plans dates. He sets direction. He creates experiences. She responds to that. That's often why the relationship begins. But as emotional investment grows, his behavior changes. Not because she demands it, because he wants to protect what he has. He wants peace. He wants stability. He wants to avoid conflict. So he begins making small adjustments. He skips a night with friends to attend her event. He chooses her preferred restaurant instead of his. He adjusts his schedule to accommodate hers. He adopts her social circle. None of it feels significant. Each decision is justified, temporary, reasonable. But leadership doesn't disappear in dramatic gestures. It dies through 1,000 small submissions. Over time, he stops making unilateral decisions. Not consciously. He just stops. He waits, he asks, he checks, he measures. And eventually, he can't remember the last time he acted without considering how she would react. By the time he notices, the pattern is already established. She has adapted to being the decision maker. He has adapted to being the one who follows. And both of them feel uneasy without knowing why. This path is particularly dangerous because it's driven by good intentions. He isn't trying to manipulate or avoid responsibility. He's trying to be loving. He believes compromise equals maturity. What he doesn't realize is that compromise without boundaries is surrender. The critical moment in this erosion happens when emotional investment crosses a threshold. When he becomes more invested in keeping the relationship than in maintaining his own center. That's when behavior shifts from preference-driven to fear-driven. This is what I call the emotional investment trap. Once you're over-invested, you stop making decisions based on what builds a strong relationship long-term. You start making decisions based on what avoids loss in the short term. Your goal changes from growth to preservation. Preservation feels safe. It's not. When you're afraid of losing someone, you start managing their emotions. You soften your truth. You prioritize their comfort over your integrity. You stop inviting them into your life and start rearranging your life around them. This trap is reinforced by social conditioning. Men are taught that emotional investment equals commitment, that showing how much you care increases your value, that sacrifice proves love. But attraction doesn't operate on moral logic. It operates on psychological dynamics. The more you signal that her approval determines your behavior, the more power you give away. Not because she wants to dominate you, but because you've revealed your leverage point. Once someone knows you're afraid to lose them, your autonomy becomes negotiable. This doesn't require manipulation. It happens naturally. Requests start small. A change in plans, a skipped workout, a weekend adjustment. Each request tests the boundary. Each compliance weakens it. You learn that saying yes brings peace. Saying no brings emotional turbulence. So you choose peace, again and again. That choice trains you. Eventually, your decisions are no longer based on desire or conviction. They're based on avoiding discomfort. That's when you stop being a partner and start being a regulator. And here's the part most men miss. She doesn't feel safer when you do this. She feels less attracted. Because attraction requires tension, not conflict, but polarity. A sense that you are grounded, directed, and capable of holding your own course, even when emotions fluctuate. When you abandon that, you don't become easier to be with. You become heavier. Both paths lead to the same destination. A relationship where she holds all the cards, and you're constantly trying to figure out how to play your hand without losing. The difference is only in how quickly you arrive. Understanding which path you're on matters because the recovery looks different. But the root problem is the same. Leadership was either never established or slowly given away. And once it's gone, no amount of communication will bring it back. No emotional explanation will restore attraction. Only a change in structure will. That realization is uncomfortable, but it's also freeing, because it means the problem was never about your worth. It was about your position. The most dangerous moment in any relationship is not conflict. It's not betrayal. It's not even distance. The most dangerous moment is when a man becomes emotionally overinvested and mistakes that overinvestment for strength. That was the point where everything shifted for me. When I realized how much I had to lose, my behavior changed. Subtly at first, then completely. I started optimizing for her comfort instead of the health of the relationship. I focused on keeping things intact rather than keeping them alive. This is the emotional investment trap. Once you fall into it, every decision becomes filtered through fear. Fear of losing her, fear of upsetting her, fear of destabilizing the relationship. That fear doesn't make you more loving, it makes you cautious. And caution is the enemy of attraction. I stopped creating experiences and started asking what she wanted to do. I stopped leading interactions and started following emotional cues. I stopped maintaining my own boundaries and started reshaping myself to fit what I believed she needed. None of this felt weak in the moment. It felt responsible, thoughtful, mature. But what it really was loss aversion. When something becomes valuable, the fear of losing it outweighs the desire to grow it. That fear distorts judgment. It shifts focus from building something better to preventing something worse. And once that shift happens, everything changes. I began managing her emotions instead of expressing my preferences. If she seemed tired, I adjusted. If she seemed disappointed, I compensated. If she seemed uncertain, I reassured. Not because she asked me to, but because I couldn't tolerate the tension. Over time, I became hyper-attuned to her emotional state. I knew the signs of frustration before she spoke. I could predict disappointment from tone alone. I learned how to prevent emotional reactions before they surfaced. This skill felt like intimacy. It wasn't. It was surveillance. And surveillance changes the surveillant. When you're constantly monitoring someone else's emotions, you stop listening to your own. Your instincts dull, your preferences fade, your sense of direction erodes. You become reactive instead of intentional. This is where vulnerability to manipulation appears. Not because she was manipulative, but because the structure allowed it. When someone knows your decisions can be influenced by their emotional reactions, those reactions gain power. A sigh, a pause, a look of disappointment. None of it has to be intentional. The effect is the same. Requests begin small, completely reasonable. A different restaurant, a schedule change, skipping a commitment. Each time you comply, you reinforce the pattern. You teach her that your boundaries are flexible. You teach yourself that your autonomy is conditional. Eventually, your entire life becomes negotiable. How you spend your time, who you see, what you prioritize, even how you express yourself. All of it runs through an internal filter. Will this cause emotional turbulence? That filter becomes automatic. You don't even notice it working. You just stop doing things that might create discomfort. This is how men disappear inside relationships, without anyone forcing them to. The emotional investment trap doesn't feel like loss. It feels like devotion. That's why it's so effective. Society praises it, rewards it, tells men this is what commitment looks like. But commitment without self-respect is instability. She didn't feel cherished by my overinvestment. She felt constrained by it. My constant emotional monitoring made the relationship heavy, predictable, devoid of spontaneity. Attraction requires space, not distance, but autonomy. When a man loses his autonomy, he loses the tension that fuels desire. I could sense her pulling back, not because she cared less, but because the dynamic had shifted. I was no longer inviting her into my life. I was orbiting hers. That orbit breeds contempt, quietly. And with contempt comes loss of respect. Not malicious, just instinctive. No one respects someone who has abandoned himself. The cruelest part of this trap is that it punishes good intentions. I wasn't trying to manipulate or control. I was trying to love. And in doing so, I dismantled the very structure that made love sustainable. The more emotionally invested I became, the more power I gave away. The more power I gave away, the less secure I felt. The less secure I felt, the more I invested. It was a closed loop. Breaking out of it required recognizing something uncomfortable. Emotional intensity is not the same as emotional health. Feeling deeply does not justify behaving weakly. Caring does not require self-sacrifice to the point of disappearance. When men confuse emotional investment with leadership, they lose both. The trap doesn't end relationships quickly. It suffocates them slowly. Through accommodation, through fear, through the quiet abandonment of self. By the time most men realize what's happening, they don't recognize the man they've become, and neither does the woman they're with. That's the real cost of overinvestment. Once emotional overinvestment takes hold, it rewires how decisions are made. I didn't notice it at first. I still believed I was choosing freely. But in reality, every choice now passed through a silent filter. Not a moral one, an emotional one. Before asking what I wanted, I asked what reaction my choice might produce. This is what I came to recognize as a fear-based decision matrix. It works quietly, efficiently, automatically. Should I go out with friends tonight? The matrix runs its calculation. How tired is she? Did we spend enough time together this week? Will this create disappointment? How much energy will it take to smooth things over afterward? Should I stick to my gym schedule? Another calculation. Will she feel neglected? Will she interpret this as avoidance? Is it worth the potential tension? At no point did I ask the simplest question, what do I want to do? That question had become irrelevant. The matrix didn't care about my preferences. It cared about emotional outcomes, about minimizing friction, about keeping the emotional climate stable. Over time, this way of thinking became second nature. I stopped noticing it was happening. That's when autonomy disappears. When decisions are made to avoid negative reactions rather than pursue meaningful direction, a man stops living deliberately. He lives defensively. And defensive living produces anxiety, not fulfillment. I could feel it in my body. A constant low-level tension, not fear exactly, anticipation, like waiting for something to go wrong. I was never fully present because part of my attention was always scanning ahead. The matrix made even simple choices feel heavy. Choosing a restaurant became a negotiation. Planning a weekend became strategy. Maintaining friendships felt like a diplomatic effort. I didn't lose my independence all at once. I lost it by 1,000 small calculations. This pattern creates what psychologists call learned helplessness. Not the dramatic kind, the subtle kind. You begin to believe that your authentic choices will inevitably cause problems, that being yourself leads to conflict, that independence equals selfishness. Over time, you stop trying, you stop asserting, you stop initiating. You wait to be told what's acceptable. This doesn't happen because a woman demands it. It happens because the man conditions himself to avoid discomfort at all costs. The Matrix rewards compliance with temporary peace and punishes authenticity with emotional turbulence. So the system optimizes for peace. But peace without self-respect is not peace. It's suppression. As the Matrix strengthens, something else happens. Decision paralysis. I found myself unable to make even small choices without overthinking them. What used to be instinctive became exhausting. I second-guessed everything. Not because I lacked intelligence, but because I no longer trusted my right to choose. The irony is that this behavior is often mistaken for thoughtfulness, sensitivity, emotional maturity. From the outside, it can look like care. From the inside, it feels like erosion. The Matrix also trains men to become experts in emotional prediction. I became skilled at reading micro signals, tone changes, facial expressions, timing. I knew when to speak and when to stay quiet. I knew which version of myself would be best received in any given moment. That adaptability came at a cost. I lost access to my instincts. Instincts are not reckless. They are data. They are the body's way of processing reality faster than conscious thought. When you override them repeatedly in favor of emotional management, they atrophy. Eventually, you don't even know what you want anymore. You only know what's safe. This is the final stage of the fear-based matrix. When desire is replaced by risk assessment, when preference is replaced by prediction, when life becomes a series of emotional calculations. The matrix fails for a simple reason. Relationships built on fear-based compliance cannot generate respect or attraction. They can only generate dependence and frustration. She feels a partner who lacks conviction, someone who mirrors instead of leads, someone who reacts instead of decides. That doesn't feel safe. It feels unstable, and I felt invisible to myself. I wasn't expressing a life she could join. I was managing reactions she didn't ask me to manage. I wasn't grounded. I was cautious. Both of us lost something essential. The matrix promises harmony. What it delivers is stagnation. No amount of communication can fix this, because the issue isn't misunderstanding. It's structure. As long as decisions are driven by fear of emotional consequences rather than clarity of direction, the relationship cannot regain polarity. Polarity requires difference, tension, movement. It requires one person to stand somewhere solid and invite the other to meet them there. The fear-based matrix prevents that by making standing feel dangerous. The most painful realization was understanding that this system didn't protect the relationship. It hollowed it out. It trained me to disappear and trained her to compensate. By the time I recognized it, the matrix was automatic, unconscious, deeply embedded. But once seen, it can't be unseen. And once you see it, you understand that the solution is not to manage emotions, better communicate more gently, or accommodate more skillfully. The solution is to step out of the matrix entirely. Here is the most counterintuitive truth I had to accept. The behaviors I believed would make her love me more were the exact behaviors that made her respect me less. Accommodation, flexibility, constant emotional consideration. I thought these were signs of growth, of maturity, of commitment. In reality, they were erasing the very traits that created attraction in the first place. This is what I now understand as the authenticity paradox. At the beginning of the relationship, I was decisive. I moved with direction. I made plans and invited her into them. I didn't ask who I should be. I showed up as who I was. That was attractive to her. Not because it was perfect, but because it was grounded. As my emotional investment increased, I abandoned that ground. I became less decisive because I was always seeking input, less confident because I was always monitoring reactions, less independent because I was always adjusting. I thought I was becoming a better partner. What I was actually becoming was harder to desire. Attraction erodes when authenticity disappears. This erosion is gradual. It doesn't feel like rejection. It feels like distance. A subtle cooling, a loss of enthusiasm that has no obvious cause. She doesn't wake up thinking I no longer respect him. She just feels less drawn, less excited, less engaged. And that reaction is not cruelty. It's instinct. People are not attracted to those who abandon themselves to maintain approval. They are attracted to those who remain intact under pressure. I began to see this dynamic more clearly when I stopped looking at relationships emotionally and started looking at them structurally through the lens of leadership. In any organization, leadership matters. Not because leaders are superior, but because direction is required. Companies where leaders seek consensus on every decision don't feel empowering. They feel chaotic, directionless, inefficient. Employees don't respect leaders who can't decide. The same psychology applies to relationships. When a man constantly seeks approval checks reactions and avoids firm decisions, he doesn't create safety. He creates uncertainty. Someone has to hold the frame. Someone has to take responsibility for direction. When that role disappears, the system destabilizes. This doesn't mean authoritarian control. It means responsibility. A leader who listens but still decides. Who considers feedback but doesn't outsource authority. Who can tolerate disagreement without collapsing or appeasing. I had misunderstood this completely. I believed that leadership in relationships meant dominance or insensitivity. So I rejected it. I replaced it with consensus, with emotional management, with constant accommodation. What I didn't realize was that I wasn't eliminating power. I was surrendering it. And surrendered power doesn't disappear. It creates imbalance. The business analogy made this undeniable. Companies that give employees everything they ask for don't create loyalty. They create entitlement. They don't inspire trust. They lose respect. In the same way, relationships where men consistently defer don't create grateful partners. They create frustrated ones. Not because women want control, but because they don't want to be with someone who can't hold direction. Saying no is not cruelty. It's structure. Boundaries are not rejection. They are definition. I had been afraid that asserting myself would push her away. In reality, my refusal to do so was dissolving the relationship from the inside. What makes the authenticity paradox so painful is that it punishes men for good intentions. I was trying to be considerate. I was trying to make things work. And every effort I made through accommodation made the situation worse. Understanding this forced me to confront a deeper truth. Attraction is not created by catering to someone's expressed preferences. It's created by maintaining your own identity while inviting them to participate in your life, not subordinating your life to theirs. When a man loses respect for himself even quietly, his partner senses it long before he does. And once respect erodes, no amount of emotional labor can replace it. This realization wasn't liberating at first. It was unsettling, because it meant that fixing the relationship would require me to tolerate discomfort, to risk tension, to stand somewhere solid even if it wasn't immediately appreciated. But it also clarified something essential. The problem was never that I wasn't doing enough. It was that I was doing the wrong things for the wrong reasons. I was optimizing for short-term peace at the expense of long-term attraction. The paradox is simple. Trying to be liked makes you less attractive. Being grounded makes you trustworthy. And trust is what allows attraction to survive over time. Once I understood that the path forward became clear, though not easy. The lesson I had to learn slowly, painfully, is this: love does not ask you to disappear. Any relationship that only works when you silence yourself is not a relationship built for longevity. It's a performance. And performances exhaust the performer. Many people believe that being a good partner means being endlessly flexible, endlessly understanding, endlessly available. But life does not reward those who abandon their center in the name of harmony. It drains them. Real connection is not created by avoiding discomfort. It's created by having the courage to remain yourself when discomfort appears. This lesson applies far beyond romantic relationships. It shows up in careers, friendships, families, and personal identity. The moment you begin shaping your decisions around fear, fear of disappointing, fear of conflict, fear of loss, you stop living deliberately. You start living defensively, and defensive living slowly disconnects you from who you are. A meaningful life isn't one where everything feels smooth. It's one where your actions still make sense when things feel tense, where your values don't collapse under pressure, where you can stand in your choices without needing constant permission or approval. If there's one thing worth protecting, it's your ability to choose from clarity instead of fear. Not aggressively, not selfishly. Calmly, honestly, consistently. If this message resonates with you, I'd like to hear from you. Leave a comment and share what part of this spoke to your experience. And if you value thoughtful, grounded conversations about relationship psychology and living with integrity, consider subscribing to the channel. We're here to talk about the truths that actually hold up over time.